The gala had been all glass and light, a meant-to-impress room carved out of the city's newest tower, where crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, and waiters moved through the crowd with trays like quiet constables. Madison Hail stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, shoulders back in the way she had trained herself to stand for nearly a decade, feeling the city unspool below her in a grid of headlights and late trains. Her dress was elegant without bravado. Her hair, pulled into a knot at the nape, was a compromise between thoughtfulness and armor. Around her, investors spoke in clipped sentences. The press smiled with teeth sharpened for sound bites, and somewhere a photographer angled for a candid that would become tomorrow's headline. She had gone because business required it, an acquisition, an impression to be managed, and because Chloe had insisted. There is a way children simplify decisions that makes grown things look ridiculous. Chloe's logic had been absolute. If Madison was going to meet fancy people, then the girl would wear the silver shoes that made her feel like a princess. Chloe had braided her own hair with stubborn fingers and applied lipstick with the solemnity of a small monarch. Before they left, Madison had watched her daughter practice a smile in the mirror and felt it like a benediction, a small, private prayer folded into that public night. The evening moved in plans and performances. At one point, a board member rose to offer a toast, measured, proud, full of the language of growth. And Madison watched the room respond with polished applause. Then came a quieter moment, when someone thought it charming to set up a staged Meet the Future tableau for charity. 5 wealthy donors had been invited to stand near the mezzanine in a line, each introduced as an exemplar of civic generosity, and photographs were taken, and cameras loved the symmetry. Chloe, who had been hovering with lemonade pressed between her palms, found the line of suits and smiles irresistible for all the wrong reasons. She darted forward, a comet of small determination, and stood before the men as if they were a row of gift-wrapped options. Madison moved faster than she intended, closing the space between her daughter and the photographs, correcting a stray curl, smoothing a sleeve. But before Madison could usher her back, a person in a maintenance uniform cleared his throat. Daniel was not the sort of person who attracted attention by force. When he stepped into the light, he looked like someone who belonged to another, practical world. Boots that had seen scaffolding rain and winter salt, hands with a faint oil smear near the nails, a jacket too sturdy for polite society. He was in the room for the lift, routine check, an errand for the facilities team, and he had been asked to hold a door while a supplier carried some display pieces up. He should have been invisible, and for most people he was. For Chloe, though, he was a story. "Excuse me," Daniel said to the nearest woman without ceremony. He knelt to be level with Chloe and offered a foil-wrapped ice cream bar he had fished from a pocket, a concession he kept for children at odd hours, because his own had loved such a thing on construction site mornings. The ice cream had been cheap and inconsistent, a vanilla chocolate that was not fancy at all. Chloe accepted it like a treaty. She looked at Daniel as if the world had just folded itself into a manageable shape. Madison felt a familiar tightening, that protective cord that had shortened since the funeral and long nights and the solitary choices. The room's chatter dimmed for her. She noticed the smallness of Daniel's hands, the careful way he spoke, the light that came into Chloe's face when she accepted the treat. There was no melodrama in it, A child had been offered something nice by an otherwise anonymous man. Madison's pulse suggested caution. The rest of her, quieter, said, "Watch." By the end of the evening, Chloe had announced loudly and in front of cameras, who were only half interested in hearing a 10-year-old, that she liked the janitor best. The cameras did what cameras do. They captured the line of the 5 men's faces, the polite frowns, and a flash framed Madison with a hand to her daughter's shoulder that was both possessive and bemused. In the days that followed, column inches took liberties. CEO's daughter chooses janitor over 5 millionaires became a headline because the world preferred absurdity to complexity, and because the image was a neat inversion. Money had been measured and found lacking by a child. Madison read the morning coverage with coffee cooling beside her, the penthouse quiet except for the steady smallness of the refrigerator's hum. She could have edited it out with a prepared statement, a dry corporate brushstroke denying that anything was staged. But there was a voice in her that had grown from grief into truthfulness. She typed a short reply to the PR firm. Let the story stand. There was no press benefit to be had from denying a child her delight. What the headlines couldn't notice in a room that preferred spectacle, were the small things that happened after. Daniel, who had no interest in portraiture, happened to work on the weekend at a nearby site on Riverton, where Tully Development was finally lifting beams into place for a mixed-use block Madison's company had designed with the city's sustainability team. He showed up on a Monday with a hand-drawn sketch in his back pocket, a cross-hatched thing that mapped a problem he had noticed with a temporary scaffold. He moved among the foremen with the kind of calm authority that comes from having to solve real problems quickly. If you shift the loader this way, you'll unload with less deflection, he told the crane operator, and the operator did it. No one watched it happen the way a gala is watched. But the structure shivered less, the workers breathed easier, and Chloe, after school that day, shouted her delighted approval like it was a miracle. Madison found herself taking calls with one hand and checking sketches with the other, because the city work was hers and liability was always in her periphery. She had to be careful. The board watched with a hunger for clean numbers and immaculate optics. Her agenda was a column of priorities, and the child's schedule was another. Yet the presence of Daniel in their orbit was not merely an intrusion, it became a curious counterweight. He held ladders with the same patient tact he used to steady Chloe on swings. He arrived at the school fair carrying enough cotton candy sticks for a small army, and left with gratitude he never sought to convert into social cachet. Their courtship, if it could be called that, unfolded like things that are genuine. Over shared tasks, a willingness to help in practical ways, a refusal to be dazzled by Madison's titles. He did not act like a man proposing himself to a woman of stature. He acted like a neighbor who wanted his child to be safe and his son to have someone who could teach him how to build a proper treehouse. There were dinners, but not the kind the board expected. There were Saturdays when Chloe made pancakes and insisted that Daniel eat one first as a test of character. If he hesitated before the third syrup-slick bite, he failed the test by a narrow margin. If he asked for more coffee, he passed as someone who could endure the small domestic negotiations of family life. On an overcast afternoon in November, when the city smelled of wet stone and citrus from street vendors, Madison found herself sitting in an elevator with Daniel during a maintenance inspection. The elevator had the gloss of a corporate shell, brushed steel, a mirrored wall, advertisements offering decluttered lives. Chloe had been at school, Madison had an hour before a board rehearsal, and Daniel was checking the cables, making sure the tension was right. They joked about elevators, the way strangers sometimes do, to cover the awkwardness of silence. He told a story about teaching his son to breathe slowly during thunderstorms. He called it the 7. He counted with them out loud then as if it were a liturgy. 1, 2, 3, up to 7, then back to 1. It had the gentle authority of a life where one had to teach children to manage fear. The elevator shuddered and stopped. A cable snapped, a small thing made monstrous by the confined air. The car dipped, paused, and then trembled into stillness. For a heartbeat, the whole world reduced to the 6 feet of steel and glass they occupied. There were muffled voices from the hallway, a distant thud as someone banged on the lobby doors, and a camera somewhere recorded the moment without comprehension. Madison did what she always did. She took control of what she could.
Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era always did. She took control of what she could. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Breath became a metronome. Madison's hands found Chloe's. Daniel kept opening and closing the rusted hatch with a little tool he had in his jacket, as if testing the air. For the second that mattered, he moved like someone who had measured the weight of people their whole life and had found a way to distribute it. When they were finally freed, a hush of applause rose from the small crowd that had gathered. Chloe, grinning with the wildness of survival, declared that Daniel was indeed the best at holding doors. The photographs that followed captured less the heroics than the newness. Madison's hair mussed from stress, Chloe's cheeks flushed, Daniel's hands still trembling a little. Later, in the quiet of the car ride home, Madison felt gratitude in a form she had not been able to name. Not romantic yet, not purely practical, but a recognition that someone else would hold the small edges of her life if given the chance. The board, however, did not like random moments. The company's image was not built on elevator rescues and family sweethearts. It was built on spreadsheets and deadlines. Richard Evans, who had been on the board since before Madison's appointment, and who measured loyalty in influence and the closeness of his bank accounts, had watched the gallery of headlines with a twitch that he cared for in private. His concern was not for Madison's happiness. It was for the company's valuation. In his mind, spectacle could be dangerous. The city's elite had not forgiven unpredictability since the dips of the market 2 years prior. To them, an unvetted introduction, a janitor who might be photographed, risked something slippery and expensive. The pressure came gradually, like temperature rising in a room. Minutes at the board became questions that had been sharpened into knives. "We need clarity," Richard said in a meeting where Madison had presented a plan for Riverton's next phase. "Perception affects investment. We must consider our exposure." His voice was smooth, but there was an edge. The other investors, who were practiced at signaling discontent without committing to the work of solutions, nodded. Madison answered with what she had always used against intrusion: facts. She showed projetario revenue, contingency plans for community outreach, and a timeline. Nora Patel, her COO, who had been a steady ballast through organizational storms, watched quietly and then offered operational contingencies. "We can prepare a media statement that frames this as community engagement," Nora said. She placed her fingers on the table as if steadying the room. "We can also formalize volunteer clearance for our facilities vendors. It was not an attempt to erase what had happened. It was an attempt to contextualize it on corporate terms. Madison agreed in the board minutes, but left the meeting with a weight that had nothing to do with ledgers. For a few days, nothing else happened beyond the ordinary shocks of life. Chloe traded stickers for a classmate's laminated heroes. Daniel taught his son, Ethan, the right angle at which to hammer a wedge so it would hold. Madison navigated zoning paperwork with an ease that hid the way her chest tightened whenever someone said image. Then the accusation arrived like a letter slipped under a locked door. It came from an internal complaint filed through the company's HR portal, an allegation that Daniel had accessed a restricted section of the Riverton site after hours the week before, had manipulated a temporary support so that an inspector's report might be favorable, and had been seen, according to an anonymous witness report, carrying a small device that could have interfered with monitoring systems. The language was formal, clinical, the accusation was precise. The board needed to act, and the company's policy around safety and liability required immediate steps. Madison read the complaint in her office with the blinds pulled halfway down, the light turning the city to a low sheet of pewter. Her first reaction was a hot, immediate defense. Daniel did not play the angles of power. He was blunt in his motives. His hands knew honesty. But she also knew how accusations can be constructed by those who wish to make someone problematic in order to remove the inconvenient truth. She began as she always did, with procedure. Nora convened HR and legal. The company placed Daniel on temporary administrative leave with pay, a standard protective measure against presumption and risk. The phrasing was careful, pending investigation. Madison spoke to Daniel with a voice that split gratefulness from strategy. "We'll be thorough," she said. "We will follow the logs." The first days of the investigation were a study of small, relentless things. Camera DVR exports with timestamps, access logs showing badge swipes, server sync notes, weather reports, and the slow, surgical grind of HR interviews. The footage that had been offered as proof was murky, a night record where a silhouette walked near a scaffold. The anonymous report had claimed a device. Daniel swore he had been on site only to fix a misaligned handrail after a shift, and that he had left before sundown. Chloe insisted on an ice cream outing in the raw cold of December, which in Madison's mind was an exercise in disobedience and ought to logic, until the girl's smile melted something measured and necessary. They went to a little shop that sold scoops in winter, where the clerk wrapped cones with a practiced hand and the air smelled of sugar and spilled milk. It was a test Madison remembered from the gallery. An ice cream in winter was a measure of warmth. Who would insist on a child's whim, and who would argue about jacket collars and potential mess? Daniel came too, carrying a thermos of coffee that had something of the estimation of a man who understood small rituals. Chloe declared him victorious because he bought 2 scoops and did not check the price. She plunged through snow flurries with an audacity Madison admired. The days of investigation were also days of small tenderness. Daniel arrived at Madison's penthouse one afternoon with a folded sheet of paper tucked into the pocket of his jacket, a diagram showing the load path he thought had been misrepresented in some old drawings, a sketch done in ballpoint, annotated with numbers that meant something to men who read stress not as poetry but as a geometry of responsibilities.
He had no pretense of corporate jargon. He offered instead the clear language of craft. He surprised Madison with his precision. "If you look at the temporary shoring here," he said, tapping the paper with a stain of graphite on his fingertip, "the load transfers through a different vector when the beam's set that way. It feels wrong because someone used the prototype notes, not the final revision." She read the diagram like one might read a letter from an old friend who knew the grammar of her anxieties. Her professional life cared about blueprints and load paths. So did his, but from the angle of what keeps people safe rather than how a project looks on a quarterly rendering. That slant mattered. The friction with the board increased as the public tasted scandal. Richard called for a closed session where he framed the company's vulnerability as a reputational danger that required swift and decisive action. "We can't afford loose ends," he said. His voice carried the patient certainty of someone convinced by the moral arithmetic of influence. Madison listened, and then she pushed back with the facts she had curated. The misdated footage, the subcontractor's anomalies, the maintenance report that had been edited. She demanded that HR halt the leak of information to external press until their investigation concluded. She asked for the board's patience, and in Nora's steady eyes, she felt the room begin to tilt toward process rather than panic. There was a moment later that night when Chloe placed a small hand on her mother's wrist and whispered, as if offering a prayer she had learned at school, "Keep him." It was not a political statement. It was child logic, blunt and immovable. Madison felt the hush of it in a part of herself that had been granular with loss and policy. She closed her eyes and thought of the small litany of things she had said to the empty apartment when grief made itself too loud. She whispered an answer back in a private prayer that was not doctrine, but a plea. Keep the child safe. Let truth find its shape. The investigation moved like a tide, alternately pulling forward and stalling. Evidence accumulated, an email from a vendor that contradicted the anonymous report's timeline, a time-stamped delivery manifest that placed the subcontractor's team in a different zone, the security camera's correct clock discovered in a backup server. When they cross-referenced phone GPS pings, the unnamed witness's device was 3 blocks away at the approximate time of the alleged incident. Small things, added together, became a ledger of truth. The day the HR director called Daniel and told him he was cleared, Madison was at a hearing where the board considered a different piece of business, whether Riverton's next phase would accelerate funding. She stepped out to take a breath and found him in the lobby, a half sandwich in his hand, an expression of a man who had been publicly doubted and privately grateful. He did not wear his relief like a banner. He took it like a quiet gift. Chloe ran into his arms as if the world had been ordered again. She clapped and declared that the ice cream test had been validated. When Richard learned that the accusation had been discredited, his posture did not change so much as his target's did. He redirected conversation to potential regulatory exposure and the unpredictable nature of press cycles. He was, as Madison had always suspected, a man who saw only immediate advantage. What followed was the small, steady work of mending. Relationships do not automatically reconstitute after the strain of suspicion. Trust reknits itself by practice. Daniel entrusted his son's safety to Madison, and, in moments that mattered, a recurring piano lesson at a neighbor's house, the teaching of how to tie a knot properly under a damp beam, the ordinary stitching of family life took root. Chloe, who watched adults with remarkable clarity, began to place Daniel in the shape of someone she could count on. She would sometimes test the waters of affection with a sharp, childlike honesty that left Madison both amused and unnerved. The courtship accelerated not with declarations, but with domestic steadiness. Daniel showed up at the penthouse with a jar of preserve his mother used to make, and Madison loved it because it tasted of mornings too early to be polite. He took Chloe to the frozen lake, where they laced their hands around cheap skates and fell and laughed, and the scene became less a photograph than a memory that would hold its warmth into the winter.
If the market punished them with a dip, it would be because markets were fickle. If it rewarded them, it would be because humans could not always be separated from work. But the test was not finished. People in power sometimes confounded humility with weakness, and Richard had not forgotten the jeopardy of unpredictability. He would press. The story was only beginning to show how stubborn reputation could be when set against the truth of ordinary kindness. Madison watched Chloe sleep that night, a small, curved thing in the bed, an elbow slightly out of the covers, and thought about how decisions are made for children differently than for shareholders. She whispered the small prayer that had become hers: "Protect what is soft." Daniel, in the hallway below, walked home to his son and stopped under the street lamp to breathe in the clean, cold air, counting to 7 in the way he had taught Chloe. Each number was a stitch in a slow repair. Ahead lay the parts no one could foresee at the gala, a smear campaign from someone who had lost profit to a competitor, an HR memo's bureaucratic grinding, a public meeting where evidence would need teeth. Ahead lay the moment when Chloe would be asked, publicly and perhaps unfairly, to choose not just for a photograph, but for a life. Ahead lay the delicate calculus of public good and private fidelity. For now, the city hummed. The blueprints on Madison's desk sat like maps of a future whose edges were not yet inked. Snow began to fall in early flurries, softening the angles of the skyline. Madison pulled her coat tighter and, for a moment, let herself imagine a kitchen full of voices, an ordinary cluster of dishes and laughter. The image steadied her in a way spreadsheets could not. She would need to defend that vision. She would learn to set a boundary for what she would accept in the world that wanted to make her choices into headlines. When the first subpoena arrived, a polite, formal thing requesting production of security footage and email correspondence for a minor inquiry into the Riverton site, Madison did what she always did. She responded with the meticulous care of someone who knew procedure better than rumors. She instructed Nora to collect everything and to preserve pristine chains of custody. She instructed legal to be watchful. She told no one to panic. In the small hours, she sat at her kitchen table and wrote a note to Chloe in handwriting that Chloe could read when the child was older. Choose people who show up. Choose people who fix things because they care. Outside, the snow thickened, and a solitary dog's paws marked transient tracks across the sidewalk. Madison thought of the coming storm in practical terms and in domestic terms. She would have to stand at the axis of two worlds, corporate demand and family need, and decide where integrity demanded her feet. The choice would not belong to the board. It would belong to her and to the small chorus of people who had become family by choice. When she locked her penthouse door and walked to the window, she found the city softened by white. There, in the hush, she understood that the story an investor had feared, a CEO's daughter preferring a janitor over 5 millionaires, could be read differently. Not as a failure of optics, but as an insistence on the moral work of ordinary humans. The headline could be a scandal, or it could be a truth. She would keep pushing for the latter. The conflict was not over. Accusations could be resurrected, reputations could be tested again, and Richard's influence could find new ways to undermine. But Madison had rehearsed for this moment. She knew how to marshal facts, and she understood the necessity of small tenderness. She would not trade her child for an illusion of perfection. That much had become clear in the weeks since the gala. In the days that followed, the team would comb deeper. Forensics would pull logs from a security vendor's backup server tucked in a warehouse downtown. A subcontractor would be called in for questioning and would reveal an invoice trail that did not match the anonymous witness's story. A time-synced external sensor, overlooked at first, would prove an alibi and reveal a deliberate attempt to manipulate footage. And when the evidence became undeniable, the board would have to acknowledge both the error and the cost of haste. Madison sat with these developments the way she sat with Chloe's sketches, patient, attentive, protective. She kept the private joy to herself in the small hours, so that when the day demanded it, she could be the steady leader the company needed. She made lunches with a practiced hand, and sometimes left a note in Chloe's backpack with a stick figure that looked oddly like Daniel, because Chloe had asked for a drawing of the family they were building in their kitchen of the future. When the public clearing came, when the HR report returned Daniel to his job with an apology logged in the company's confidential records and a formal correction sent to the vendor that had failed to maintain accurate timestamps, there would be a press release and a board meeting and the predictable turn of stories. But the decisive moment, the one that would matter to Madison, would be quieter. A day in the kitchen when Chloe would plant a stubborn, decisive kiss on Daniel's cheek and declare that she'd always known what mattered. The world could have 5 millionaires, she would say with the absolute logic of a child. What she wanted was someone who would show up. Madison imagined that small ceremony often, in the steadiness of late nights when the city hummed and contracts lay beside a mug of tea. She imagined a kitchen table with chipped edges, laughter lodged in corners, and a quiet sentence she could say without press release. Status does not build a family. Love does.
For such a moment, she would stand with the messy, ordinary work that made love possible. The fixing of hinges, the checking of blueprints, the ironing of a school uniform. For now, there were filings to prepare and people to protect. For now, she would choose truth. The story's next challenges waited beyond the window. A small scandal to be diffused, a boardroom to be steadied, a child's public choice that would have wider consequences. The snow softened the city's edges, and inside Madison's head a plan took its first drafts. She would not let panic govern her. She would defend the fragile things that mattered. Chloe's safety, Daniel's dignity, the company's integrity. She would, in the way she had always done, balance ledger and lullaby. Outside, the flakes thickened, and inside, the kettle began to sing. Madison took a breath, measured the day, and prepared to go back into the light. The fight for ordinary goodness, the one that would ask her to choose between optics and fidelity, was only just beginning. She turned the kettle off with a practiced flick and let the steam fog the window for a long moment. Outside, the snow kept falling in even flakes, softening the hard lines of the city the way a margin softens a page. Inside, the apartment smelled of citrus and tea. The small drawing Chloe had taped to the fridge, a house with 3 stick figures, one with a mop and one with a tie, wavered in the draft like a tiny proclamation. The first email arrived before she finished her second cup. It was from legal, a concise summary of the subcontractor's deposition and the forensics addendum. They had timestamps cross-checked against the warehouse censor and a municipal maintenance log. The vendor had failed to maintain their chain of custody. The anonymous witness's profile traced back to a failed consulting engagement and a bank transfer with a memo line that matched a shell company tied to one of Richard's lesser-known projects. It read like proof and like a blade. It read like vindication and like danger. Vindication because Daniel's name could be cleared in the open records and the HR notice could be posted with an addendum. Danger because Richard, when pressed into a corner, broadened his scope of impact. He did not fold. He redirected. He opened new channels, activated allies, and kept his smile perfectly composed. Madison had learned that the real work after a scandal was not only in the facts, which could be marshaled, but in the narrative people wanted to believe. Facts corrected the record. Stories reshaped the future. By mid-morning, the company's PR director was on a conference call, voice taut with the mistrust of a team that had been burned before by optimism. They would release a statement within the hour, concise, factual, apologetic where necessary, careful to respect privacy and legal bounds. They would not rehearse the venom of the anonymous accusations. They would not give them oxygen.
Madison read the draft once, twice. She struck a line that could be read as self-congratulatory and added a single sentence that was not on any template. We are committed to the dignity of our people. It was small and almost useless in its humility, but it was the policy she wanted to live by. The board meeting was set for Thursday. Between now and then, there would be interviews, follow-up audits, and a risk that Richard would enlist an outside firm to cast doubt on the new findings. She anticipated it, like a chess player eyeing a counter. If he attacked, he would not do it with the crude thrust of the anonymous witness. He would do it with subtlety. Seeded questions in investor calls, a leak to a columnist from someone close to the situation, a reminder of the company's fragile market position. She drew up talking points that did not sound like fighting. She wanted to be tireless, not combative. Tiredness had the odor of defeat. Steadiness smelled of work. Daniel called late morning, voice thin from the stress, but steadier than she felt. He had not yet gone back to the office. HR had arranged a temporary private workspace so he could come in without the spectacle. He refused cameras. He refused interviews. He wanted to be present for his team and for his daughter, not a spectacle for someone else's curiosity. When she told him the vendor had been exposed, he said nothing for a long time, and then, "We'll be in the right place, eventually." It was not a victory cry so much as a vow. At noon, Chloe's teacher emailed a photograph. A science project in progress,
Chloe in a striped sweater with a glue stick blackening her fingertips. Madison's heart tightened and lightened at once. She replied with a smiling emoji and a note. "Tell her I'll make her pancakes tonight." She typed it and retyped it, always conscious of the way even small promises had weight. She closed her laptop and watched the city quilt itself into silence, letting herself imagine the kitchen scene she had rehearsed in her head for nights. The thought steadied her. The press release went out in the early afternoon. It was clear and calm. The vendor issued their own statement minutes later, acknowledging process failures and promising reforms. The headlines the next day would be kinder, or at least less cruel. But the online currents still carried the undertow of skepticism. A blogger with a taste for outrages was already poking for more. Madison knew the Internet's appetite was insatiable. She also knew that calm work had a gravity the Internet could not replicate. She kept returning to that. When Thursday arrived, the boardroom felt smaller than it had the last time she'd faced it. The long table retained the sheen of authority. Outside, the city was a steel gray that made the building glow like an island.